Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 3. Psychoanalysis, Behaviorism, and the Science of the Mind.
In the last lecture, we explored substance dualism, the position that the mind and body are fundamentally distinct kinds of things, and we surveyed various arguments both in its favor as well as in favor of its primary competitor, physicalism or materialism, the view that ultimately everything that exists is physical in nature. There's no doubt that something like substance dualism was the dominant position on the mind, at least from the time of Descartes in the 17th century all the way through the 19th century, and that versions of dualism continue to hold sway to this very day. But there's also no doubt that the turn of the 20th century saw some major new developments in the philosophy of mind, and the key development was the rise not only of modern science in general, but specifically of the science of the mind, or psychology in particular. Or perhaps I should say key developments, for there were two very different conceptions, indeed diametrically opposed conceptions, of just how the science of psychology should proceed. The first one was perfectly comfortable with dualism as we've developed it so far, but the second one was out to bury it, and deeply. We'll begin with Sigmund Freud's famous theory of psychoanalysis. Freud and psychoanalysis. Freud is a man whose influence on the 20th century intellectual world is perhaps without equal. Born to Jewish parents in what was then Austria in 1856, he became an outstanding medical doctor. Working primarily in neurology, he went on to develop elaborate theories of the nature and activities of the human mind, as well as the famous clinical process of psychoanalysis, also known as the talking cure, whereby patients suffering from various psychological ills would undertake extensive analysis with an analyst in order to uncover the unconscious or subconscious roots of their problems and, by exposing them, cure the patient. Indeed, Freud is often credited with the discovery of, or in some cases invention of, the whole idea of the unconscious or the subconscious, a region of the mind where various thoughts and feelings, particularly of a sexual nature, might be repressed. And he used this discovery not merely to attempt to cure people, but also to analyze such phenomena as dreams, literature, religions, and culture in general. Psychoanalysis went on to become one of the most influential intellectual movements of all time, with important ramifications not merely for psychology, but also for thinkers studying literature, politics, religion, and positively every aspect of culture you can imagine. In 1932, Freud was awarded the Goethe Prize in appreciation of his contribution to psychology and to German literary culture in general. A year later, the Nazis took control of Germany and promptly burned Freud's books, along with many others. Freud noted at the time, quote, "What progress we're making. In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Now they're content with merely burning my books," end quote. Unfortunately, though, that didn't last very long. In fact, many members of Freud's family were eventually to be murdered by the Nazis, and when the Nazis took over Austria in 1938, Freud was one of the lucky few who managed to emigrate, and he died in exile in London in 1939. Now, Freud and many others were quite disposed to think of psychoanalysis as very much a scientific theory, as a scientific account of the human mind. And while we would need a whole course to explore that theory in any detail, an overly brief sketch for our purposes might sound something like this. Psychoanalysis asserts that the mind has an extremely complex structure, with regions and aspects and operations referred to by such terms as ego, id, libido, the unconscious, repression, sublimation, and so on. These terms make no obvious reference or connection to anything physical such as the brain. There's no suggestion that, let's say, the ego is one part of the brain and the id is another, or that either of these might be identified with any particular modes of brain operation. Nor do these terms make any direct reference or connection to physical behavior. Sure, Freud will offer quite complex analyses for why individuals behave as they do, for example, towards their parents, by invoking these concepts, but the terms and concepts themselves don't make any direct reference to behaviors. So what we might see in psychoanalysis is substance dualism taken to its most sophisticated extreme. Not only is the mind understood in terms completely distinct from anything physical or behavioral, as Descartes argued it should be, but we now have an impressively complex theory of mental terms attempting to explain nearly all aspects of human behavior. As such, surely, psychoanalysis is a candidate for a science of the mind, a dualist science to be sure, but a science nevertheless, for what else is a science but a complex and sophisticated theory about how something works? But wait a minute, what is science anyway, and is psychoanalysis really one? Well, fortunately and unfortunately, we're not going to answer those questions here. Unfortunately, because they're very interesting questions, but fortunately, because they're complicated questions which would require long answers best reserved for full courses on the philosophy of science and psychoanalysis. What we will do, though, is note that the question of whether psychoanalysis is a science has been a hotly debated one. Its defenders point to its sophistication and complexity, and its ability to explain all sorts of human behaviors, individual and social. Interestingly, its critics point to the very same features, arguing that psychoanalysis shares that complexity and that ability to explain things with such pursuits as astrology, and these days maybe even with something more generally reputable as economics, both of which are complex, sophisticated theories involving numerous interesting concepts and phenomena, able to tell appealing explanatory stories about all sorts of phenomena, but typically only in retrospect, after the fact, and they're generally incapable of supporting either reliable predictions, directly observable phenomena, or repeatable experiments. So economists and astrologists can both tell you afterwards, after something happens, give you a beautiful explanation of it, but they are not very reliable at predicting in advance what will happen. It's this thought that scientific theories need to do more than just explain things, but rather that they should support predictions, direct observations, and be subject to replication, or repeatability, that forms the core of the alternative conception of the science of the mind we mentioned earlier, the one that's diametrically opposed to psychoanalysis. To appreciate this competitor, we'll step back a bit and sketch a little bit of the history of psychology. The science of the mind. The origin of psychology as a genuine science is typically traced to the end of the 19th century. To be sure, if we understood by the term psychology something very general like the study of the mind, then there have been psychologists dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks 25 centuries ago. But their method of thinking about the nature of mind was just that, thinking, self-reflection, introspection. And the people doing this thinking were generally referred to, not surprisingly, as philosophers rather than as psychologists. To the contrary, the key word for us now is science. To think of something as a science in something like the contemporary sense is to think of something involving controlled experiments and careful observations. And it was only towards the end of the 19th century or so that psychology turned from a purely think-about-it endeavor to one where scientists were trying to make experiments in order to study the human mind. Except that from early on, it was also recognized that scientifically studying the mind was not going to be a very easy thing to do. And it surely isn't if you believe in Cartesian substance dualism. For according to dualism, the mind is private, internal, accessible only by its owner. It's just not the kind of thing that more than one person could ever access or observe. And right away, that causes problems for any desire to study it scientifically. For another thing that science seeks, in addition to controlled experiments, is the ability to replicate those experiments, to have other people replicate the experiments. That is, the phenomena being studied must be the sort that more than one person can access, that more than one person can experiment with, and that the results obtained by one person can also be obtained by other people. Indeed, the very idea of objective knowledge of something is the idea of knowledge which many people can share. But insofar as the dualist mind is private and internal, it's in principle not accessible to others. It seems therefore to follow that no objective knowledge of its nature and operations is possible, and if not, there could be no science or scientific study of the mind. What we do have on the dualist picture is subjective knowledge at best, that privileged access to our own internal thoughts, sensations, and feelings, as we mentioned earlier. Now, you might think that this could support a kind of science of the mind, namely one that's based on what people report or say about what's going on inside their private minds on the basis of introspection. Except that even here it was observed that there were problems. A while back we rather casually mentioned the idea that the mind has a kind of infallibility with respect to itself, that it's somehow incapable of being wrong about what's going on inside it. It now began to be appreciated around the turn of the 20th century that there are limits to that. Indeed, introspection was found to be surprisingly unreliable and difficult to achieve with any real precision. We talked about a couple of examples earlier. Here's a couple more. Can you judge whether two quick flashes of light produce exactly the same sensations or merely similar ones? How precisely, in fact, can you even describe your various sensations of light, of sound, of taste, and so on? These sorts of limits on even the introspective, subjective aspects of the mind, combined with the impossibility of studying the mind objectively, made the mind something very difficult to study scientifically. If there were to be a science of psychology, the thinking then went, it must not consist of an effort to study the inner private world of the dualist mind, but in fact of an effort to study something else, something which is accessible to multiple investigators, something about which there could be objective knowledge, namely human behavior. The questions to be asked, then, look something like these. How do subjects observably respond to well-defined stimuli, and how can their responses be molded by variations in stimuli? What are the laws of behavior relating stimulus input, the conditioning or training of the subject, and observable behavioral output? And how can these questions be answered while making no reference to the unobservable, private, subjective mental states which allegedly intervene between the stimulus input and the observable behavioral output? In short, scientific psychology begins not as a science of the mind, accurately speaking, but perhaps more precisely as a science of behavior. And perhaps no figure better expresses that orientation than the great 20th century behaviorist B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner and the Critique of Psychoanalysis. Skinner was born in rural Pennsylvania in 1904. After a brief time dallying with the idea of becoming a fiction writer, he earned a Ph.D. in psychology from Harvard University in 1931, where he basically remained a member of its faculty until his death in 1990. His talent in writing, if not manifest in a career as a novelist, was at least manifest in his prolificness. He published countless articles and books, including a fictional account of what a utopian communal life organized around behaviorist principles might look like. This book is called Walden 2, and I strongly recommend it. He became arguably one of the two most famous psychologists of the century, along with his diametrically opposed counterpart, Sigmund Freud. Skinner shared many of the complaints about dualism that we've already mentioned, that it sees the mind as private, internal, subjective, and consequently makes the mind unfit as an object for objective scientific study. He was also deeply opposed to Freudian psychoanalysis, again for some of the reasons we sketched. While both Skinner and Freud agreed that environment plays a great role in shaping our behavior, Freud believed that it did so via various unobservable mental entities, processes, and states intervening between the observable stimulus and the observable behavioral responses. Skinner objected to these generally because, as we've seen, unobservables were unscientific. But he also objected for two more particular reasons. First particular reason is this, that unobservables of the sort asserted by psychoanalysis are always underdetermined by the actual observable evidence or facts. To illustrate this idea of underdetermination, consider the following scenario. You observe someone sitting at a table before some food, who then reaches for the salt shaker and shakes it heartily upon his meal. That's all the observable evidence or facts you have, and it's your task, as a scientist, to offer an explanation of these facts. Just why did that person do the thing you just observed him to do? Well, here's one theory. He loves very salty food, and he believed the dispenser before him contained salt, and thus he shook it all over his plate. This theory involves two unobservable inner mental states. The man loves or has a preference for something, and he believes something. So far, so good. But now notice that many other different mental states might be invoked to explain the very same behavior. Maybe he loves pepper, and believes the shaker before him to contain pepper. Maybe he doesn't love very salty food. He just likes ordinary amounts of salt, but believes for whatever reason that the food had been grossly undersalted. Or maybe he believes he's being observed, by you, and simply wants to mess with your head by pouring ridiculous amounts of salt on his food. Or maybe he believes his mother is observing him and wants to make a point to her food is undersalted. Or maybe, going Freudian, he never got over his childhood Oedipal complex and thus can't help but remind himself of his mother by salting his food in this way. And so on. The point is that any given bit of observed behavior can be explained by many different, wildly divergent combinations of inner mental states. And that's what it means to say that the observable facts underdetermine the mental theory. The observable facts alone cannot determine just which set of inner mental facts is the true or correct one. And if that's true, then we would never be able to determine what is the true inner theory of the mind. And if that's the case, then invoking inner mental states simply cannot be the way to go to obtain a genuinely scientific theory of the mind, or so says Skinner. But there is a second particular reason that Skinner rejects psychoanalysis as well, beyond the fact that the observable facts underdetermine the mental theory. It's that even if we could somehow settle on the one single correct mental theory in any given case, the theory would actually be explanatorily empty. To see what this phrase means, consider an oft-quoted example from the 17th century French playwright Molière. In a famous satirical scene, he imagines a medical student undergoing an oral examination where he's asked to explain how a certain potion puts people to sleep. He responds by mentioning the soporific quality of the potion as the cause of its effectiveness, which sounds on the surface like a perfectly good causal explanation of the potion's ability to put people to sleep, until you ask a little more carefully what the phrase soporific quality really means. And when you do that, you realize that soporific quality simply means a quality tending to put people to sleep. If so, then the explanation, the soporific quality puts people to sleep, amounts to saying that it's the tendency to put people to sleep that puts people to sleep, which is absolutely no explanation at all of how it puts people to sleep. Invoking soporific quality, in other words, is explanatorily empty. It doesn't explain the thing it's supposed to explain, even if it might sound on the surface as a very scientific thing to be saying. Well, Skinner suggests, purely mental theories such as psychoanalysis amount to the same thing. Because the concepts in the theory are all unobservable, they can only be meaningfully defined in terms of observable behavioral consequences. Imagine, for example, that you tried to explain why your friend Harold tells a lot of jokes, and you said, well, it's because he's got a great sense of humor. Where sense of humor is supposed to be some feature of his personality, something mental, something non-physical. But the problem is that we can't observe a sense of humor directly. It's not the kind of thing we can open up a head and see whether someone has one or not. So what does the phrase sense of humor actually mean then? It means something roughly like, has a tendency to tell a lot of jokes. But then, like the Molière case, saying Harold tells a lot of jokes because he has a good sense of humor amounts to saying he tells a lot of jokes because he has a tendency to tell a lot of jokes. True enough, perhaps, but absolutely no explanation at all of how or why he tells jokes. And ultimately, Skinner thinks, the same is true of all the mental apparatus, not merely the id, the ego, the unconscious, and so on of psychoanalysis, but even the ordinary sensations, thoughts, and desires of everyday dualist psychology. Being unobservable, these mental states are such that we can only define them as tendencies or dispositions to observably behave in certain ways. But then, just like soporific quality and sense of humor, they're not actually capable of explaining anything we do. They're merely indirect ways of describing our tendencies to do those things. Hence, Skinner concludes, what a science of the mind needs is something different, something which leaves out all this inner mental talk, id, ego, unconscious, thoughts, sensations, desires, and instead something which discusses only observable stimuli, conditioning, and observable behavioral responses. In other words, what we need is the science of behaviorism. Two kinds of behaviorism, methodological versus philosophical. with the preceding discussion in our background, we might actually distinguish these two versions of behaviorism, or maybe two different domains of behaviorism, methodological versus philosophical. Methodological behaviorism is a program for science, more or less as we've just described, where scientists attempt to study only observable behavior and its various causes and conditions, and they leave Cartesian dualism behind simply as a theory that's unfit for science. But now leave it to the philosophers to go a step further to a much more radical position. Philosophical behaviorism is an account of the semantics of mental language. Semantics is the study of meanings. To study the semantics of mental language is to offer a theory about what we really mean when we use various words for mental things, words such as mind, thought, sensation, and so on. And here's where philosophical behaviorism makes its bold move. When we use mental language, it claims, we don't mean what we might think we meant. Rather, just as scientific psychologists study only observable behavior and its causes, so too mental language gets its meaning by referring to behavioral dispositions. When you ascribe mental states to someone, for example, when you say, Fred believes that the Mets will win this year, or Jane is feeling sad, what you're really doing is making various sorts of comments about Fred's and Jane's overall patterns of behavior. What you are not doing is making reference to the sorts of inner private states that substance dualism accepts. So construed, philosophical behaviorism amounts not merely to a rejection of Cartesian dualism, but to a denial of its very possibility. When we speak about mental things, we're really just speaking, if indirectly, about patterns of behavior, of perfectly, purely physical, non-mental behavior. We never, in fact, even refer to private mental things as the dualist construes them. So methodological behaviorism is the way scientific psychologists proceed by objectively studying behavior only and ignoring anything inner, private, or mental. But philosophical behaviorism is the position that our ordinary mental language already only refers really to behavior, so we never even make reference to a separate private mind in the first place. Now, if B.F. Skinner is the go-to guy for methodological behaviorism, that title for philosophical behaviorism would have to go to the British philosopher and Oxford University professor Gilbert Ryle, who lived from 1900 to 1976. And if there is one go-to book for the subject of philosophical behaviorism, it's Ryle's influential 1949 book, The Concept of Mind. Gilbert Ryle and philosophical behaviorism. Now, according to Ryle, the whole mind-body problem arises because of a very basic sort of error that we tend to make, what he calls a category error. People treat mental words as if they were in the same logical category as physical words, when in fact they aren't. Well, what does this mean exactly? Ordinary physical terms, words for physical objects, states, and events, and so on, refer to ordinary external things located in the space around us. The word building refers to a physical object out there. The phrase soccer match refers to a physical event out there. By analogy, we tend to think of ordinary mental language as also referring to objects, states, and events, and so on, but inner ones, inner objects and states, in here, in the minds, which dualism tells us are different sorts of things than anything physical. So, the word mind itself refers to something inner and non-physical, and words such as thinks, believes, feels, and so on must refer to inner and non-physical states or events. By treating physical language and mental language as being in the same category, in other words, we treat the words to refer to exactly the same sorts of things, the only difference being that one is external out there and the other is internal in here. But now, Ryle argues, this is a mistake, a kind of linguistic mistake. For, he claims, mental language belongs to another kind of logical category altogether from physical language. It shouldn't be compared with physical language. To illustrate his idea, he uses a famous example of an individual taking a tour of a university. He imagines the individual having pointed out to him, there's this building, there's that building, there's the administration building, there's the dorms, there's the classrooms. And then at the end of the tour, he imagines the individual asking, oh, those buildings are really lovely. Now can you show me the university? And this, of course, is a very strange thing to say. He's just been shown the university. As Ryle diagnoses the problem here, the mistake this person has made is due to his not quite understanding how to use the word university as it's properly used in English. And something similar goes on when we treat mental language as if it referred to inner, non-physical objects and states in the same way that physical language refers to outer ones. For just as the word university does not refer to some other object alongside all the buildings constituting the university, so too mental words do not refer to other things alongside all the purely physical things which, on Ryle's view, constitute reality. In fact, Ryle argues, our mental language is really a fancy or indirect way of referring to behavior, to behavioral dispositions. So the goal of a philosopher is to correct this error and give proper translations of mental terms. That is, spell out how what appear to be references to a mental world distinct from, inside us, alongside the physical world, really are ways of speaking about the ways that people behave. And once we do these translations, Ryle thinks, the whole mind-body problem will simply evaporate, for we'll no longer have to explain how the two realms exist side by side and interact, if in fact there aren't two such realms. There's only two different ways of talking about the physical world. Some examples of philosophical behaviorist linguistic analysis. We already had one above with Skinner, when we saw how referring to someone's sense of humor seems on the surface to be a reference to some mental trait or feature, but is really ultimately defined only as the tendency to tell a lot of jokes, which is, of course, a behavioral tendency. So understood, saying that someone has a sense of humor does not amount to suggesting that they have a mind inside them, one property of which is the sense of humor. It's merely to describe their behavior. Similar analyses can now be offered for various other mental traits or activities. Consider the attribution of thoughts or beliefs to people, rather paradigm mental states as we've seen. When we say Fred believes it's raining, for example, it looks as if we're saying something about Fred's inner mental life, that he has this belief in his mind about rain. But really, the behaviorist now suggests, this sentence does not ascribe a private inner state, but merely indicates such things as that Fred is likely to carry an umbrella, or wear a raincoat, or stay inside, or say the words, it's raining, and so on, all of which are observable behaviors. Or similarly, to speak of someone's emotions or their character, to say that someone is angry is ultimately to describe their tendency to do angry-like things, like shout and swear. Or to say that someone is virtuous is ultimately to say that they're disposed to engage in virtuous behaviors, and so on. When we realize that all mental terms are like this, that speaking of minds and mental things is really a way of speaking about external physical behavior, then there's no need to invoke a Cartesian private mind, the kind posited by dualism, and thus no mind-body problem to deal with. 2 points in support of philosophical behaviorism. First, there's no doubt some kernel of truth to the movement, for there does seem to be some sort of close conceptual connection between mental states and behavior. To say that there's a conceptual connection is to say something very specific. Even dualists will grant that there's a causal connection between mental states and behavioral states, as we'll explore in later lectures. But to say there's a conceptual connection is to say something stronger, something very congenial to philosophical behaviorism. It's to say that the associated behaviors actually play some role in the very definitions or concepts we have of the mental, that we understand what mental states are precisely in virtue of their relationship to behavior. Let's take a look at a few examples to illustrate this. Pain. Part of the very concept of pain, it seems, is avoidance behavior. Someone who didn't understand that pain was something to be avoided simply would not have the concept of pain as we understand it. There's therefore a conceptual link between pain and certain kinds of behaviors. It's not merely that pain causes us to avoid the behaviors which in turn cause pain, but rather that what pain is, in part, is something to be avoided. Desires. Desires, by definition, are states that typically lead to their satisfaction. Part of what it is for a state to be a desire for beer is that it typically leads to beer-seeking behavior. If someone were to say, "I desire beer, but I am in no way disposed toward seeking a beer," we'd say that they don't quite understand what a desire is. So the very concept of a desire is linked towards this behavior. And finally, beliefs. Although it's less obvious here, there does seem to be a similar conceptual connection between beliefs and behaviors. Suppose again that someone were to say, "I believe that it's raining. I believe that if I go without a raincoat, I'll get wet, and I desire not to get wet," and then added, "I'll go without a raincoat and get wet." We'd again say something is wrong. Such a person must not understand what a belief is. They must not have meant by the word believe what we mean by believe. For if they did, they'd understand that those beliefs combined with that desire should not result in one's going out and getting wet. So what it is to be a belief is closely connected with certain kinds of behaviors. So our concepts of mental states do seem conceptually connected to behavior, at least to some degree, as the philosophical behaviorist suggests. There's a second point that helps support philosophical behaviorism as well. It also seems plausible that if two people differ in mental states in any way, that difference would have to be reflected somehow in behavior. If you like meatloaf and I don't, for example, we behave differently in the vicinity of meatloaf. Or if your itch sensation in response to an allergen is even a little bit stronger than mine, you'll scratch more quickly or rigorously. So it seems that we might say there could be no difference in mental states between two people without some sort of difference in their behavioral disposition. So the mental states are linked to the behavior. Similarly, from the opposite direction, if two people behave differently in relevant conditions, there must be some underlying mental difference between them. Suppose I take photos of Moby Dick, the great white whale, while Captain Ahab shoots spears at him. Why? Because I love him and Ahab hates him. So just as there could be no difference in mental states without a difference in behaviors, so too there could be no difference in behaviors between two people without some difference in their mental states. Putting these together suggests that mental states and behavioral dispositions are very closely, intimately connected, just as the philosophical behaviorist insists. That, unfortunately, is where the good news ends for the behaviorist. For the position also faces a number of difficult problems, especially in the small details. We'll look at three. First, it's very counterintuitive, particularly in its claim that sentences using mental words can or ought to be translatable into sentences about behavior. After all, if by the sentence, "Tom believes it's raining," we really meant something behavioral such as, "Tom sees his umbrella, he'll probably take it," then why wouldn't we have just said that in the first place? Second, in fact, further, the translations between mental language and behavior are generally unworkable for various reasons. First, it just doesn't seem possible to give truly satisfactory translations of mental sentences into behavior sentences. Tom believes it's raining, but that belief could lead to umbrella behavior, or raincoat behavior, or staying indoors, or going out naked if someone likes to be outside naked in the rain, and so on. There just are not any unique behaviors associated with this particular mental state, or really any mental states whatsoever. And almost any mental state could cause almost any behavior in the right contexts. But then the idea of accurately translating the sentence, "Tom believes it's raining," into some sentence or sentences about specific behaviors seems absolutely useless. More fundamentally, the translations seem unlikely to achieve what is their ultimate aim, the elimination of reference to mental language. For any translation that has a chance to be satisfactory almost certainly will involve reference to various further mental language. Yes, Tom's belief that it's raining might lead to his umbrella-carrying behavior, but only if he also believes that umbrellas will protect him from the rain and further desires another mental state not to get wet. Indeed, no single mental state ever leads to any particular behavior on its own. It does so only as part of a very large interconnected network of mental states. So you just can't match up some individual mental state with any behavior, as the philosophical behaviorist would like to do in translating mental sentences into behavioral sentences. And finally, it seems easy to conceive of various counterexamples to the behaviorist claim, namely conditions under which we'd hold that a given person does indeed have some mental state, but where they simply fail to behave in the way the behaviorist would like to translate the mental state attribution sentence. Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam imagines a race of super Stoics who could feel intense pain without responding to it in any behavioral way. But the fact that we can conceive of these indicates that our concept of pain, let's say, is just independent of our concepts of any particular behaviors. We can conceive of pain without connecting it to any behaviors. But if so, then talk about pain cannot be translated into behavior talk. Third and final problem for philosophical behaviorism has to do with introspection. And it's simply this. It just seems that we're aware of our own mental states in a way inconsistent with what behaviorism says. We're aware of our occurring qualia, our inner sensations, even when we're not aware of any particular behavioral dispositions. Even if pain typically did lead to certain kinds of behaviors, what we're aware of during its occurrence is its intrinsic feel, what it feels like, and not its behaviors. And so when we ascribe pains to others, what we are making reference to is that feel, not to any behaviors. So the mental is not so easily dispatched into the behavioral as the behaviorist would have us believe. In the end, these problems outweighed behaviorism's various merits, and behaviorism is now a position that has rather completely lost favor. Indeed, a major blow to behaviorism was the linguist Noam Chomsky's famous scathing critique of Skinner's 1959 book on verbal behavior. In that book, Skinner attempted to give a behaviorist theory for how we learn and master language, and in his critique, Chomsky just absolutely devastated every piece of the behaviorist platform. That critique was pretty much the end of methodological behaviorism, and it began to usher in more contemporary theories of cognitive science, which are far more comfortable in talking about mental states again. And although philosophical behaviorism lingered for a while, it no longer has any significant proponents today. In conclusion, then, this lecture has been about the science of the mind. If there's to be such a science, it seemed, it has to be something objective and observable. And so Cartesian dualism and the Freudian theory of psychoanalysis, which was so compatible with dualism, are going to have a hard time of counting as scientific, believing in the inner states of the mind. A much better alternative to dualism, at least from the scientific perspective, was behaviorism, which attempted to be a science of human behavior. And going along with that scientific program was the philosophical position of philosophical behaviorism, which tried to dispose of dualism by suggesting in effect that it never existed, that a proper understanding of our mental language would actually reveal no commitment to the special, separate inner mental states of the Cartesian dualist. But behaviorism simply couldn't cut it, and by the last quarter of the 20th century was largely out of favor. Its failure, though, didn't leave a vacuum behind, nor did it leave dualism triumphant. For in that period, philosophers were quickly devising and arguing for other alternatives to dualism besides behaviorism, and it's to the first of these, the identity theory, that we shall turn in the next lecture.
This ends Lecture 3.